Many are familiar with the dreadful and bizarre events carried out by Shunyuda, also more commonly known as the Envious One during the late 1980s. Although many barely know the long history that led to Shunyuda's insanity and the creation of his drug and paramilitary empire, very few are also unaware of the brave men that dared to stand up to Shunyuda, though risking the label of being called a terrorist and wrongfully gaining the charge of treason and/or sedition. Join me as we uncover the forgotten and troubling history of Shunyuda's early life and the terrible impact he made on his home island of Sendai. Before we can understand the events that led to Shunyuda's troubled state of mind, we must first take a look at a brief overview of the history of Sendai Island. Sendai Island, though it was its own country for most of human history, was absorbed and annexed by the early Japanese Empire following the Meiji Restoration. Since the island was south of Japan, the Japanese government feared it would be colonized by the European powers and used as a stepping stone to invade Japan. Over the years, the island proved itself to be a useful base of operations for the Japanese Navy, as well as a great supply hub for reinforcing the empire's hold in Taiwan and Korea. Much later in the 1930s, the Japanese constructed an aircraft carrier on the island, which they named Hayago, or Iron Warrior in the old Sendai language, in honor of the locals who helped to construct and later man the vessel. The vessel would go on to serve in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War under the direction of Captain Minato. Unfortunately for the vessel, it was heavily damaged during the Battle of Leyte Gulf and had to return to the city of Fukuoka in the island of Sendai for repairs. Following this battle, the Japanese Empire's might dwindled severely, and it was becoming clear that the nation was losing. But due to the Japanese religious zeal for their emperor, they were unwilling to surrender and were ready to fight to the bloody end. To compensate for the loss of men, Japan started passing laws to draft men as young as 15 into the imperial army in defense of the home islands in anticipation of an Allied ground invasion. Such was the case for young Shunyuda. It is unclear as to whether or not he knew of Gaiachi before the Sendai gang wars, as he too was conscripted around the time Shunyuda was. But what we do know is that Shunyuda was posted in Fukuoka to defend the city in case of American invasion. But because an aircraft carrier was being repaired in the docks of Fukuoka, the Americans chose to launch a firebombing campaign throughout the city to prevent the ship's repair. At this time, the Allies chose to drop incendiary bombs on Japan due to the fact that most cities throughout the island were predominantly constructed of wood and paper. Consequently, the various firebombing campaigns throughout Japan resulted in a higher death toll than that of the atomic bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Since Shunyuda was present during the bombing, at such a young age, he was deeply traumatized. To add salt in the wound, Japan would later surrender, and Tojo would fail to honorably commit suicide according to the Bushido Code. The emperor would also come to denounce his divinity, which was the final blow for Shunyuda, as he was a fervent believer in Shintoism. The Japanese public was quick to label the loss of the war on the very soldiers that fought for their nation, as they were unable to cope with their own defeat. Japan's own soldiers were ostracized, mocked, and harassed for surrendering and losing the war instead of dying a death of honor in the battlefield or by means of seppuku. Shunyuda, enraged by his nation's defeat, abandoned by his own family, and unwilling to lose his sense of nationalism, created his own version of Shintoism. In his mind, the kami rejected the emperor for mishandling the war, and instead they wanted Shunyuda to bring back the old empire that Japan once had. This time, instead of the islands being under the sole dominion of an emperor, Shunyuda wanted to become a shogun of Japan. For those unaware, before the Meiji Restoration, Japan was ruled by a shogun and his shogunate. Essentially, Japan was a military dictatorship under a general, and the emperor was a revered figurehead until the Meiji Restoration. A common misconception is that Shunyuda was a follower of Yokiya Mishima, based off of the fact that both he and Mishima were both far-right terrorists attempting to overthrow the government. However, Yokiya wanted to give more power to the emperor rather than create a shogunate, and there is no evidence to suggest such a link between the two as many claim, though it may be possible that Yokiya inspired Shunyuda's later actions. Shunyuda came to obsess the days when Japan was ruled by shoguns, so much so that he lost his mind and proclaimed himself to be a samurai, and wore the armor of one to try and legitimize his claim of wanting to be a shogun. Many experts and psychologists now believe he wore the armor as a last effort to cope with his past, perhaps even as a means to come across as more threatening or aggressive than he really was to combat feelings of weakness and helplessness. Now, in order to topple the government, Shunyuda allied himself to the far right and began selling cheap drugs to the Yakuza in exchange for manpower and weaponry. This would lead to him creating the infamous black boxes. The black boxes were, as the name suggests, black jewelry boxes modified to carry an unknown substance that once inhaled played with the user's sense of time and toyed with the user's sense of nostalgia to create a euphoric effect. To this day, we still don't know what substance was in those boxes, as Shunyuda never shared the recipe and instead monopolized the boxes for funds. There are rumors that Shunyuda may have potentially used his own drug, hence his erratic behavior, but there is no strong evidence to suggest this. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, in order to remain hidden, Shunyuda organized his own ring of assassins. They were nicknamed the yokai for publicly executing their victims before seemingly vanishing in thin air. Government officials, cops, and others who opposed Shunyuda in any way were viciously executed by the yokai. At the same time, Yuda managed to also infiltrate and manipulate some members of the Japanese government and military into his own bidding. Shunyuda became so powerful that even the Yakuza became afraid of him and dared not oppose him. Instead, they completely allied themselves with Shunyuda for fear of assimilation and were promised new rights by Shunyuda once the new shogunate was established. Shunyuda earned the nickname the Envious One for his bloodlust and for his fervent desire for power and absolute control over the whole nation of Japan.